All right. Well, good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. My name is Bobby Haggard, and I'm one of the consultants here at TrinSoft. I've been at TrinSoft nearly 5 years and spent over the last 15 or so years working on different ERP solutions. So I found one thing that's consistent on any of the ERP and accounting platforms I've worked on is getting access to data that's collected, and exactly trying to figure out how to get that information out. And that's exactly what our team is here. We created this webinar to go over Power BI. So on our call today, we will show you how to be a data hero with Power BI and how you can become the Office All-Star by creating reports, visuals, dashboards that will impress management and coworkers alike. Now, we went ahead and muted all of the phone lines to try and cut down on some of the background noise. If you have a question, which we absolutely encourage, please use the Q&A feature within the Zoom webinar tool. We'll be managing those questions, and we'll be sure to address any of those questions throughout the webinar. And as you can imagine, some of those questions will certainly be specific to you and your data, which we may look to take offline and follow up with you after the webinar. All right, let's jump right in here. First up, our speaker introduction. I'm going to be joined on the webinar today by a couple of my coworkers. Matt Wood, he has been with our TrinSoft team for nearly a decade, and he is our Dynamics team lead and lead project manager, and he is over both of our Business Central and Dynamics GP teams. We're also joined by Nicholas Jackson. He is one of our senior consultants on the Business Central team and has been working with ERP and accounting systems for about 5 years himself. All right, as I mentioned, this is a webinar mini-series all about Power BI. So today's webinar is all about preparing and shaping your data to make that reporting within Power BI a breeze. Today, the team will be going over how to use Power Query for data transaction, where to get data from, and much, much more. In addition, there is a second webinar in the series where that's about building the report, including measures, filtering, visualizations, and more. That webinar is scheduled for Thursday, March 25th at 2 p.m. And then finally, there's a third webinar in the series that'll cover how to publish and share those reports with your coworkers. That is scheduled for Tuesday, April 13th at 2 p.m. So at the conclusion of this webinar, please go to our website, TrinSoft.com, navigate to our events page, and please sign up and register for these additional webinars in the series. So as I know that we have a mixture of clients and those who are new to TrinSoft, just wanted to quickly hit on who we are as TrinSoft. We were founded in 1996, and we've since achieved the highest level of Microsoft certifications available, as being recognized as a gold certified Microsoft ERP partner. Over the last 2 decades, we've done well over 100 ERP installations with multiple organizations and offices throughout the world. We currently have about 200 or so active clients in roughly 17 or 18 states. And then what we do. So we are experts on the Microsoft Business Platform, and we do all things related to ERP installations, project management upgrades, help desk support, etc. In addition, we have some clients that we work with who are Power BI only clients, meaning we support their reporting needs, help write reports and visuals, and then they use another partner or a different ERP system for their accounting and backend products. Additionally, we have a development and document management software called TrendSoft that can handle all of your accounts payable automation needs, document workflow, image capture, scanning, storage, and much, much more. All right, so that was just a quick intro, quick overview of who we are as TrinSoft, quick overview of this webinar series. With that, I will be handing it off to Matt Wood, who's going to take us through just a quick intro of Power BI, and then Nicholas will take over through some of the data prep with Power Query. So Matt.
All right, thanks, Bobby. Yeah, so like Bobby said, I am the team lead here at TrinSoft and project manager. Also help out on the BI team. So I'm going to just give a quick introduction here, and then we're going to kind of get into the real meat of this webinar with Nicholas on the Power Query. But before we can even get to Power Query, we have to kind of decide where do I get my data, and then how do I access it. So just one slide here to quickly go over. So first of all, where does that data live? That's the first question you need to ask yourself. So at some point you say, I want to do reporting on sales, and I want to compare that sales by a product line or something like that. So I kind of know what I want to report on, but I need to know where that data lives. So that's the first step. Does it live in your ERP? Is it in a custom database you've created? Is it in Excel? Is it on a website? Whatever that may be, where is that data source located? So once I've got that, that point I'm ready to get into BI, and then I have some options on how I pull that data in. So the first thing is they do have built-in connectors, and it's not just Microsoft products. Of course, BI is a Microsoft product. So it's going to connect to a lot of their products, but it also has many more. And you can see, I just took a quick screenshot here of that page. You've got a file source, which would be your Excel, text files, JSON, things like that. Of course, you can pull from database direct, whether that be SQL, Access, some kind of Oracle database, IBM, anything like that. Then we have the Power Platform. For the most part, what that is what Microsoft used to call the Common Data Service. They have changed that name to the Dataverse now. So what that allows us to do is pull in data from multiple systems into almost like a data warehouse, where I can set up certain tables and create that Dataverse that they're calling it. So I might have CRM and Business Central, for example, in that database, and then I can pull from those tables to report on. The other option is the Azure platform. So if I'm hosting up in the cloud, whether that's Azure SQL or just something I have up there, I can connect to that. And then the one I've got the screenshots of here, which is the online services. So you can just look through that first list, and you can see that scroll bar goes much further down, but you see SharePoint on there, Business Central, Salesforce, Google Analytics. So a lot of already built-in connectors that you can connect to and get that data. And as long as you kind of know the table structures behind those, you can pull that data in. Of course, with any of these that are kind of built in database, Power Platform, online services, you do need credentials. You're not going to be able to just connect, obviously, and hit any database. You're going to need a user within that system and credentials to log in. And as you hit that get data, it will ask for those. The other options that you can also just hit APIs. So just using simply like an OData connection, ODBC, things like that. And then the last one I put on there is custom connectors. So maybe none of these fit in the box that you need, and we need to build something custom. And we do have resources here on our development team that can help out with that. So if it's something you're not seeing here, or it's not in one of these files or one of these databases, feel free to reach out and we can try to help you get that, whether we write some kind of Python or we put it in some kind of database for you. We can work on that. So that is, where is my data and how do I access it? That's basically it on that part. Now I've got my data, but it's not pretty. It's ugly. Or potentially I've got 5 different tables and I need to combine them in order to do my Power BI report. So that's where I'm going to hand this off to Nicholas, and he will be using, just for simplicity's sake, and we know we have lots of people from all kinds of different systems, he is going to focus on a source from Excel. But just think, no matter where this data come from, the Power Query works the same. So I'll hand that off to Nicholas now.
All right, and Nicholas, I'll stop sharing my screen and you should be able to take over here.
Sounds great.
And also for anybody on the line as well, we have placed the registration link in the Q&A section about where to find those additional webinars.
All right, thanks, Bobby. Thanks, Matt. Let me share my screen real quick. All right, so we are going to take a look at a tool called Power Query. This is inside of Power BI as well as Excel, which I will show here in a second. What I have up on the screen right now is basically just the homepage of Power BI Desktop. Power BI Desktop is an application that you can download for free and you can install to your machine, and you can just run it, and this will be what you see when you start it. It's a very basic blank application that we'll get a little bit more into in the next sessions. Mostly this session, we're going to be focusing on a subset of the application called Power Query. As you can see here, the first thing that it asks is it wants you to add some data to your report. Obviously, to build some reports, you're going to need some data associated with it. And as Matt showed previously, there's a lot of different options up here for our data. We have some common ones up here, but if we look at the get data options and we go to more, we can see all of the different options here in a second. Yep, all these different options of where we can get our data. There really is a lot out of the box, but like Matt said, we can also create some custom connections for you. In this example, we're going to use Excel. It's a very common data source for a lot of different people, and it just works well. So we're going to use Excel, and we actually have one text file. Before jumping into Power BI, let's actually take a look at that data so we can get a little familiar with it first. So I've got it pulled up here in Excel. We're just going to look at some basic sales data. This is a very common use for Power BI, is being able to look at sales. We're actually able to look at a little bit of costing and profit as well. And so this is an export that you might see out of your ERP system or QuickBooks, whatever it may be. So this is very simple. We've got some sales header data, which is just kind of some overarching info about the sales orders themselves. Next tab, we've got our sales lines. These are each one of the lines associated with each one of these sales orders, as well as some costing and some profit or some pricing amounts here in this next tab. The next tab we have is a simple salesperson. This is just 3 different rows, one for each one of our salespersons. And then the last tab that we have here is the salesperson commission. This is a sheet that has the commission rates for each salesperson and the month that they are for each one of the commissions. They're a different rate for each month. All of the data right now is in one Excel workbook, and that makes it a little bit easier and a little bit cleaner, but it doesn't have to be. It can be in as many different spreadsheets as you want. You can have one sheet per workbook if you want, and we can import it that way. This just happened to be how I got the data from the system. One other thing to notice about this is that all of these tables are formatted as tables inside of Microsoft Excel. So as you can see, you probably recognize this formatting a little bit. The way that it's done is you can take a look at the data, and when you choose format as table and you format it as a table, this does a couple of different things in Excel, but mostly it just gives it a name associated with this range. And that'll come into play here in a second when we open up Power BI. I actually do have one other quick little data source. If we look at the sales headers over here, we have a payment terms code, and I wanted a little bit more info on this payment terms code. So I went into our accounting software and was able to pull a little bit more info about each one of these payment terms codes, but it gave it to me in a text file. This is the file that it output, and it's not a very pretty file. It's not Excel, it's not formatted as a table. It's actually not even a CSV or a comma separated values. It's got a bunch of semicolons separating all the different data. This won't be a problem for Power BI, and I'll show you how to import that here in just 1 second. All right, jumping back into Power BI. What we're going to do is we are going to import data from Excel. So we can simply click this first tile here, and it's going to ask us for the file that we would like to import. I've got this Power BI webinar customers data or sales data here. And let me actually close out of this in Excel because it's going to give me an error if I don't. It has to, only one file can be open at a time. So I've got my sales data here, and then I'll click open. Give it a second to churn through that workbook and look at all the possible data sources. And it'll give me a prompt like this. I've got a couple of different options in this Power BI sales data spreadsheet. You can see here almost everything is duplicated. We have these first 4 options are actually tables. You can see that by the little table icon. And then the next 4 are actually spreadsheets. If we click on one of these, we get a nice little preview of what the actual data looks like. And the difference between these, in our case, there's not really going to be any difference between the sales header table and the sales header spreadsheet. But that's because we only have one table per spreadsheet. If we had multiple tables on that spreadsheet, then we could pull each table separately and individually. For this purpose, you really could choose either one of these, the tables or the spreadsheets. But I like to err on the side of caution. I like to go with the tables. This is because if somebody later on further down the road decides to add another table to my workbook without putting it on its own spreadsheet, my report could get a little weird. So I like to play it safe, and I like to choose just the tables here. And again, that's why I like to format everything as a table in Excel. It makes everything a lot easier. So I need all 4 of these tables here. So I'm going to check each one of these boxes and tell Power BI that I want to pull in this data. And let's say I know that this data is really good. I know that it's clean. I made it myself. I don't need to do any massaging to it, or I just want to bring it in and I've got a couple of different data sources. I want to worry about doing the formatting and the massaging of it. I just want to worry about that later. That's great. If you want to, you can just go ahead and click load and you can try and build reports right off the bat with this data. However, 9 times out of 10, you are going to have to transform your data just a little bit in order to get it into the reports that you're looking for. So in our case, we are going to click transform data. If you do click load, don't worry, it's not set in stone. You can go back. But when we click transform data, this brings us into Power Query. So this is a new screen here that pops up. We can see it's Power Query because we've got the Power Query editor here up in the top. All right, let me take a quick break real quick and let me show you what it looks like in Excel. So we did everything up until now from Power BI. We're doing Power Query, and we know that the destination for our data is going to be Power BI. So we're doing Power Query through Power BI. But let's say we just want to export things into a pivot table, or let's say we just want to export things into a simple report that's not going to be in Power BI and just in Excel. Fortunately, you can use Power Query in Excel as well. So let me show you how to get to this screen real quick in Excel. We can open up, let me actually open up that sales data workbook again. And because I've got this nicely formatted as a table, if I want to open this inside of Power Query from Excel, all I need to do is go to the Data tab, and under Get and Transform Data, this is the Power Query, and it asks you for a couple of different common data sources. In this case, our data source is just this table, and I've got one cell selected inside this table. So all I need to do is click From Table/Range. And this will open up a Power Query editor inside of Excel. So everything that we cover, 99% of everything that we cover in this session will apply to both Power Query from Power BI, but also Power Query from Excel as well. It really just depends on where your data is going to end up. Now, a lot of people might ask is like, okay, why, should I do Power Query in Excel and get my Excel data looking good and then move over to Power BI? If you think you might use it in Excel, then maybe, but my recommendation is do all your data editing, all your data massaging inside of Power BI itself, because that is the ultimate ending point for all of your data. Okay, so I'll close out of this. I don't need to keep any of those changes. And we'll come back to our Power Query editor inside of Power BI. All right, so let's take a look at a different table. Let's go to the sales header table. Okay, I'll also close that workbook as well. Okay. So let me give you a quick rundown of this Power Query editor because it looks a little bit different than Excel and it performs quite a bit differently as well. So here we've got what looks like an Excel spreadsheet, and this is all of our data that's nicely previewed for us. Up here, we've got each one of our column types, and we have a down arrow, just like you would on a formatted table in Excel. And just like you can in Excel, you have your sorting options, and you have each one of your quick filter options as well. So if you want to filter something in and out, then you can do that there. Pretty simple. Next to the column header, we've got this little icon here. This is very, very important. This is the data type in Power Query. Note this is different than what the data type might have been in Excel. And when you bring in a new data source, it's going to intelligently try and guess what the proper data type is for this column. Data types are very, very important in starting in the next session when we try and build relationships between our data, because if our data types do not match when trying to create a relationship, Power BI will throw an error. So it's very important that all of our data types are accurate and all of our data types are the same if we have the similar data across multiple tables. And that will make sense here more in a little bit. One last thing to note is that you cannot edit a single cell in Power Query. It may look like you should be able to double click in one of these cells, just like in Excel, and be able to change your data, but that is not how Power Query works. Some people may say that's a disadvantage. I actually say it's an advantage. The reason why it's an advantage is because it lets Power Query be incredibly efficient and more powerful. Now, Excel, if you've ever worked on an Excel spreadsheet that has more than 1 million rows, you know how poor the performance is of Excel. However, with Power Query, you can load in 25 million rows into Power Query and it handles it like it's nothing. And that is partially because you cannot edit the data directly in Power Query. So I would much rather have the ability to work with large amounts of data quickly and efficiently than being able to edit the data. Obviously, you can do things such as filtering out rows, adding columns, and we'll get to that here in a minute. But on a cell-by-cell basis, you cannot edit the data in Power Query. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Next, over here, we have our queries settings pane. We've got a couple of properties about each one of our queries. When I say queries, side note, when I say queries and tables are interchangeable, at least in this case for our data source. A query is just a data source in Power Query. So we've got our query settings. We've got a name for this query. By default, it popped in sales headers, which is the name that it pulled from the Excel workbook table, which is great. Next down here, we've got our applied steps. This is a very, very powerful and handy feature of Power Query. And what this does is it keeps a running change log of everything that we've done to this associated query. So you'll see as we go throughout the webinar that more and more steps will be added to this list. Let's show a basic one, for example. Let's say I want to rearrange a column. Notice there are 3 steps here. I'm going to select the cell 2 customer number, and let's say I just want to move it over here. Drag it over here, and I drop it, and you can see a new step gets added called Reordered Columns. Now, if I want to undo this step and I did it accidentally, I can simply just click this little X, and that'll undo that step and bring me back to the previous step. Now, let's actually redo that. Let's move order date over here. Another very powerful feature about the applied steps is that, let's say I just want to go back in time, so to speak, and see what the data looked like at a given step. So if I wanted to see what it looked like before I reordered these columns, I can just click on this step and it takes a snapshot of what the data looks like, and it processes all these steps up until the one that I have selected here. This doesn't mean that I have undone this reordering of columns. I can simply jump back to the reordered columns and I can see all the steps that take place. These first 3 steps here, they are in here by default whenever you load in a data source. It has the source, it has the navigation, and if it changes any types, it tries to be intelligent. These are just the 3 native applied steps to any query that gets added into the system. Okay. And one other thing over here, we've got our queries, just our 4 queries that we pulled in from that spreadsheet. Here in a minute, we will pull in that other text file as well, and that will be listed under the queries section. But for now, we've just got our 4 tables. All right, now let's take a look at some of the features of what you can actually do with Power Query. Across the top, we've got a couple of different tabs. Home, Transform, and Add Column are going to be your main 3 ones. These 3 are just more so for informational and a few extra tools that you can use. Now, I won't read all of these different options to you. I just want to point out some of the more important ones and some of the ones that are most useful. First up is choosing and removing columns. This is really helpful if you have a large data source. Often when you export things from something like an ERP, you might get 100 columns in your table, and in reality, you only need 5 out of those 100. And so to easily narrow down your data, you can go to choose columns, and it gives you a list of all your columns, and you can simply check and uncheck each one of these columns. Okay. Similar, we've got keep and remove rows. If there are a certain number of rows that we want to keep, we can keep a certain number of the top rows. Or if, for example, we want to remove duplicates, then we can remove duplicate values. Very similar to how it functions in Excel. Over here, we've got split column. Split column is very similar to what the text to columns feature is inside of Excel. However, this is a bit more powerful. You can see here, it's not just by delimiter or by position. It's actually got quite a few other features built in that will allow you to accurately split your column without having to do multiple splits. And lastly, possibly the most powerful option here is this merge queries. This is very similar to Vlookup. I call it Vlookup on steroids if you're familiar with Vlookup. And we'll do an example of merging a couple of queries here in a little bit. So I won't go into this one too much. Okay. Next up, under the Transform tab, we've got a couple of different options here that showed up on the home page. But we've also got a couple of different options that can be performed to any one of the columns, and they kind of group them nicely here. These actions can be performed to any column. These can be performed to text columns, and these can be performed to number, date and time, so on and so forth. That is why it's very, very important for you to choose the correct data type when taking a look at your data. Because if not, you won't be able to do certain functions to your data. My favorite feature here in this table or in this section of Transform is Unpivot Columns. I'll show you how to do this here in just a moment. Lastly, we've got Add Column. The two most common buttons that I click on this tab are the custom column. So basically this allows you to create and write your own formula to add a new column at the end. Or you can also create a conditional column, which will allow you to say if column A has value ABC, then have the value be X, Y, and Z. Very, very powerful, very, very easy to use. All right, so those are a couple of the highlights of the different functionalities inside of Power Query. But now let's actually get to taking a look at our data and cleaning it up a bit. Now, one common question that people ask a lot is, what is clean data? People may ask, or people may hear the phrase clean data or bad or ugly data, and people may not know what clean data is or what ugly data is. And unfortunately, there's a couple of hard and fast rules, but for the most part, it's just something that comes with experience. Understanding how data works and ultimately knowing how you're going to use the data in the long run are very important when it comes to looking at the cleanliness of your data. First, taking a look at this sales header table, I'll show you a couple of tools that Power Query has to help identify the cleanliness of your data. If we take a look at the View tab, there's an option that's called Column Quality. If we take a look at this and turn this on, you can see here for each one of our columns, it gives us a quick little rundown of how quote unquote healthy or how quality the column is. Now for all of these columns, you can see we've got 100% are valid, 0% errors, and 0% are empty. So that means that this data looks pretty good, at least at first glance. Taking a look at the data, I'm going to quickly scan and look at all the different column types or data types as well. If we take a look at document type, that's text, text. This one is text as well. It looks like we've got some values that have characters in them. This is a date, this is a date, this is text, text, and text. Yep, just for reference, here are the different options. The most common ones are going to be decimal, fixed decimal, percentage, date, and text. All right, so taking a first look at it, this header table actually looks like it's in really good condition. And to be honest, that happens a lot. A lot of the times when doing exports from pre-existing systems, such as your ERP system, whether you're on QuickBooks or whatever else it may be, really grabbing data from any other refined data source, your data, odds are, is going to be really, really clean coming out of the gate, and you're not going to have to do much work to it, which is great. And it's pretty normal too, which is perfectly fine. However, there are some times when your data doesn't look as clean as it should. Taking a look at one of those examples, we can take a look at the sales line table. right off the bat, let's take a look at this document number column. You can see here, there's actually a couple of different blanks in here. This is a common problem that you see in a couple of different data sources. And in this document number column, what happened for this column is that it only gives you data when the document number changes. So here's your invoice number, and it's going to be the same for lines 9, 10, and 11. So it just doesn't list the document number. For 12, 13, and 14, it lists it, but again, it skips a few different options. Or it skips repeating the document number until it gets to the next document number. Now, this is very easy for us to understand and for us as humans to read, but when it comes to building a report, it doesn't really work very well. So what we need to do is we need to fill in this document number for each one of the items as it goes down. Fortunately, there's a tool built in to Power Query to help us do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select the document number column. I'm going to go to transform, and I'm going to use the tool called fill. This is a very similar tool to the autofill tool, or the magic handle, as a lot of people call it, in Excel, that kind of drags your data down and it automatically fills in the values for you. We have two different options. When we fill, we can either fill down or fill up. What this means is that we can either, for these blank spaces, what do we want to go into these blank spaces? Do we want it to find the next value and fill up? Meaning, do we want 07 in this line and this line, or do we want to take the value and fill it down until it runs into another value? In our case, we want to fill down, because I know that these items here are associated with this invoice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this column. I'll choose fill, and I will fill down. But nothing happens. Interesting. We can take a look over here at our applied steps. And if we want to jump back to what the data looked like before we tried to fill down, we can click to this change type step. And then we can click back to the fill down. And as you can see, there's no difference between our data and the change type and fill down. That's because one feature of fill down that is very important and really important for remembering in Power Query as a whole, blank values are still considered to be data. It may seem counterintuitive and it may not make sense, but it's one of the founding building blocks of Power Query. And when it comes to running reports in Power BI as well, blank values are still considered data. Even though these are empty and they don't have any data in them, Power Query still thinks that you might want this data and it's not going to fill over them. So what we need to do is we need to replace these blank cells with a different value to tell Power Query, hey, it's okay if you overwrite these values. There really is no data in these cells. And we can do that with a simple replace. So if we select our document number column here, we can go to replace values. The value to find, we actually want to find blanks. So we're not going to put anything here in the value to find field. Now, the way that we tell the system, hey, there's actually really no data in this cell and we don't want you to do anything with it, that value is called null, N-U-L-L, very popular in software development and in data as a whole. So we want to replace all these blank cells with null. And we will say, okay. All right, and there we go. So now we've got nulls in all of our blank cells as well. So let's try this again. Let's select document number. We can choose fill, and now we fill down. And there we go. That's the data result that we are looking for. So if we take a look, jump back and forth between the replaced value and fill down, you can see that it nicely fills down all of our numbers. All right, I'm just going to move left to the right here. And as I'm working, make sure that all of our all of our data types are correct and looking good. One thing that I did notice, this line number field, technically these are all numbers, but I'm actually going to change this to a text field instead of a number field. The reason why is that, yes, this is a line number and it is a number and I can perform arithmetic on it if I would like, but it's a line number. It's an identifier. It's never going to have, you're never going to add 20 to this value or divide it by 17 or anything like that. So just to prevent those from accidentally happening, I am going to change the type of this to text. All right, so this one looks good. All of these values across here looks good. We've got quantity, which is a whole number. All of these are whole numbers, which is good. And then we've got unit price. This is actually selected as a decimal. We want this one to be instead, we want this one to be a fixed decimal number because these are currencies. And so we'll select them there. All right, we've got a tax percentage. This one is actually a percentage, so we'll choose percentage, but oh no, that's not good. This shows tax percentage. Now the tax percentage is 500% because our data export showed it as 5 instead of 0.05, which is the actual value of the percentage. Now it's showing it as 500% or 600%. And if we try and do any arithmetic with this column, our data is not going to come out well. So what we need to do is we actually need to take this column and divide it by 100. We've selected, to do that, we've selected this column, and under our number column options here, this one got selected because this is a number column. We can actually choose standard. And here are all the different actions that we can take on this column. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this column, and for each value, we want to divide it by a given number. In this case, we want to divide it by 100. And we'll click OK. And there we go. Now we've got a tax rate of 5%, 6%, 7%, so on and so forth as it goes. All right, so that column looks good. Next up, we've got our amount field. This one needs to be a fixed decimal as well. And now we've got our amount including tax, and we want that one to be a fixed decimal as well. Okay. Everything is looking pretty good. Now, one field that I think would be pretty interesting is here we've got our unit price and we've got our unit cost associated with each one of the items. Well, it would be pretty nice to know the profit of the items, which is simply the price minus the cost. Now, in order to do this in Excel, you would write a formula to take this column minus this column, but actually in Power Query, we don't have to write a column or a formula to do that. All we have to do is select unit price, hold down the control key, and click unit cost. Now, it's important that you click those in the correct order. Otherwise, you'll get a negative value because it doesn't know which order to correctly subtract the two values. Now, since we want to add a new column with a profit, we can go to add column. From number, we want to choose a standard operation, and we want to choose subtract. This will create a new column that contains the values in the first selected column minus the values in the second selected column. Pretty neat. So we'll click subtract. And there we go. We've got a new column called, right now it's subtraction, but this has got the profit in it for us, which is simply the price minus the cost. And let's quickly double click into this column here, and we can rename this profit. All right, everything here in the sales line table looks good. Let's jump over to the salesperson table. This table is pretty simple. We've got 3 columns, salesperson name and email. Not really much to do here. All the data types look good. All right, the last table we're going to look at real quick is our commissions table or query. Now, this one is a little different than the rest. You might recognize that this data is in a slightly different format, and that's because it is. This data is in what is called a cross-tab format. This means that there are different qualifiers up here. So we have January, February, March. This might be something that you see as a result of something like a pivot table, where you kind of get summaries as columns go across the top. However, for report building, we want this data to be we want it to be in something called a tabular format instead. So instead of having January, February, March be the columns, what we want is 3 columns. We want the salesperson, we want the month, and we want the value. So we want something that says NJ January 0.03, NJ February 0.03, NJ March 0.03, so on and so forth. This will make the data a lot easier to analyze and build reports from. Now, in Excel, there's a couple of different weird formulas that you can build to do this kind of data for you. If you have come across this in the past, then you know how much of a headache it can be. However, Power Query solves all of those options or all of those problems for us. So what we have the capability of doing now is we can just select the salesperson column. We can come up here to transform, and that button that I mentioned before, Unpivot Columns, is going to solve all of the problems for us. However, I don't want to unpivot the salesperson column. I want to unpivot the rest of these columns over here. And so instead of selecting the rest of the columns, I can actually just select the one column that I want to keep, the salesperson column, click the drop-down arrow next to Unpivot Columns, and I can choose Unpivot Other Columns. Now, when I click that, there we go. We've got our beautiful data. We've got the salesperson, the month, and the commission. Salesperson, month, commission for all of the salespeople, all of the months, and the commission values associated with that. All right, everything looks good here. I just need to rename these columns real quick. This is month. And instead of value, this is going to be commission. And this is also going to be a percentage. All right, everything looks good here with the commission table. All righty, let's do one more thing with this commissions table while we're taking a look at it. This commission table has some pretty good info, but the problem is this first column isn't very useful. It's just the salesperson code, which is just their initials of the salesperson. It doesn't have their name or their email address or any other info about the salesperson themselves. We do have that data, however, in this other table called salespersons. What we need to do is we need to take the data from the salesperson's table and bring it into the commissions table. So we have one nice table with all of our data that has all the data that we need and all the info. Now, if you're familiar with Excel, then this is where you would look for a formula called Vlookup. And we're going to do something that yields very similar results to Vlookup. And I'll compare and contrast the two here in a minute. But first, let me show you how to bring in the salesperson data onto this commissions table. What we're going to use is a function called merge queries. This allows us to take the commissions table and bring in the salesperson's table to go along right beside it. If we select the commissions table and click merge queries, a little pop-up screen appears and asks us for a little more data on how we want to merge this info. First, we've got our commissions table here, which is the data that, or the query that we had selected when we clicked to merge queries. Now, the second thing it's going to ask is, okay, which table do you want to merge in? And in this case, we want to bring in the salesperson's table. Now, it needs to know how to combine these two tables. There has to be some kind of common identifier between the two. In this case, or in the case of Vlookup, it would be your lookup value. And basically it wants to know what is the column between these two tables that are the same. And in our case, it's this column here, salesperson and the commissions table, and salesperson code and the salesperson table. Notice that these columns don't have the same name, which is perfectly fine. Power Query doesn't mind. And if you look down here, when we select these, it says the selection matches 36 of 36 rows from the first table. And that's great. It means that for every entry in this table, it was able to find an associated entry in the salesperson's table. This join kind, you can just leave the left outer. This is a bit more of an advanced feature, but for left outer, it's gonna be what you're looking for in most of the cases. All right, so if we click OK, what it does is it brings in the salesperson table. Well, that's great and all. If we click on this table here, we can take a look and say, yeah, okay, I brought in the salesperson, the name, the email, all that kind of stuff, but I don't want to have to drill it down into each one of these tables. I need to expand this table and all of the data in it. And so in order to do that, we can click these two little arrows here. And what it's going to do is it's going to ask us which columns from the salesperson's table do we want to bring over. In this case, we've got 3 columns we could bring over: salesperson code, name, and email. Well, I've already got the salesperson code in the salesperson column here, so I'm going to uncheck that option. There's also an option down here called use original column name as prefix. If I left this checked, it would make the new columns called salesperson.name, salesperson.email. However, I don't really need that in this case. So we're going to uncheck that and we'll click OK. Now we can see here, it brought in our 2 columns, name and email. Let's say I just want to bring these back over here next to the salesperson, make it a bit easier to read. And now I have a more complete commissions table. This right here is a very, very powerful feature in Power Query. And so as a result, I want to do one or two more examples, if time permits, on how to merge queries. And I'll also talk about merging queries versus Vlookup. All right, let's do, I took a look at that payment method table earlier before. Let's go ahead and work with that. So we've got our sales header table and we've got the payment terms code column here. Now, this is just kind of a code that our accounting system uses, and there's not an awful lot of detail associated with this. And I want to know a little bit more about this sales header table, or about this payment terms code. So what we need to do is we need to pull in that text file. What we can do is we will come up here to a new query, and we want to choose a new source. One of the most common ones here is text/CSV. If we choose that, it's going to ask us which one we want to choose. And we'll say Power BI webinar. This is the payment method code text file we looked at before. Click open, give it a second to process it. And what do you know? Power BI is smart enough to recognize the file origin and the delimiter for what I am looking for. We got our payment terms code, days, payment days, discount days, percentage, and a nice little description associated with it. Great, super useful, and we can click OK. This will now bring it in as a new query. However, it just uses the name of the file, which is a little long. So we'll just double click over here, rename this to, whoops, not commissions. This is payment method codes. All right, and there we go. Now I've got our payment. Sorry, these aren't payment methods. These are payment terms. There we go. So now let's come back over here to our sales header table, and let's bring in a little bit more data in terms of the payment terms code. So just like before, we're going to choose merge queries. We've got our sales headers here. We want to bring in the payment terms codes column. And so, or we want to bring in this table, and now we need to tell it which columns we want to merge on. We got the payment terms column here, and we got the payment terms column here, and there we go. Selection matches 286 out of 286 rows from the first table. And we'll say, okay, everything looks good. Now, again, this just brings it in as a table, which is not what we're looking for. We want to expand this out a bit. So we click on the 2 arrows. We don't need the payment terms code because we've already gotten that. But we do want the payment days, discount percentage, and description. Now, in this case, this description field especially could be a little vague. So I do want to use the original column name as a prefix. All right, we'll click OK. And now we can see we've got our extra payment terms code data on each one of the columns. Now, I recognize, oops, there's a typo in here, and this payment terms code .discount days is kind of a long description. I kind of changed my mind, and I don't want this payment terms code before everything. Maybe if I could just abbreviate this to like PTC or something like that, I think that'd be great. Fortunately, a lot of the different actions that you apply to a query have settings associated with them. And after you have performed one of these changes, you can go back and you can make tweaks to each one of those steps that you applied to the query by clicking this little gear next to each one of the steps. So if I click this gear here, you can see here that it's now asking me which columns I want to expand. I'm good with the amount of columns I expanded, but it's asking here for the default column name prefix. Instead of this typoed long name, I'm just going to swap this out to be PTC. I'll click OK. And there we go. Now I've got PTC before each one of my descriptions. All right. So let's say this is at least a good starting point for me. I've gone through, I've cleaned each one of the columns. Everything looks pretty good to me. Oops, actually, I just noticed that this discount percentage needs to be a percentage. And this column also needs to be divided by 100. So let's do that real quick. Standard, you can divide it. Everyone divide it by 100. Okay, there we go. That looks a bit better. All right, so I've gone through my data. Everything looks good. I'm good with the data formats. I just wanted to go in and start building some reports from this. In order to save your transactions and what you did to this data, then you will need to go to the home screen and you want to click close and apply. Now, one thing that is really, really important when working with this data, or working with Power Query as a whole, is that Power Query does not touch your underlying data. So we've made all these changes. We've swapped columns, we've changed types, we've filled in data, we've done all this stuff. My original Excel workbook is going to remain untouched. Power Query creates a copy of the data and it just stores it in its memory and it will let you work from that copy without touching the underlying data, which is really, really helpful. So you don't accidentally make changes to your underlying data. All right, so now let's say I'm good with where I am in Power Query. Let's say I want to throw this into Power BI and start taking a look at some reports. So we will click close and apply here. Give Power BI a minute and it is going to load all of our data for us. Now, there are a couple of different options in terms of refreshable data. That's a question that we get a lot and say, okay, let's say I imported this Excel workbook or I pulled some data from QuickBooks and what happens when I get new sales orders or something like that, or a new salesperson. Depending on your data source and depending on the transformations that you make in Power Query, you can very easily simply just refresh your data sources and have your charts update with that new data. It's a bit more of an advanced feature. If it's something that you'd like us to show you, feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to show you how that can be done. All right, so we've got, if we take a look, this is kind of the visuals tab here. Let's go over and take a look at the data viewer tab, which is the second option here. And now we've got all of our data. We've got our commissions, the sales headers, lines, persons, all the different tables that we might need. And now we are ready to start making our reports. All right, this is definitely a cliffhanger, to say the least. This is not Power BI. This isn't your fancy, flashy dashboard that you're going to show to your CEOs, but this is arguably the most important step in building your reports. If you don't have clean data and you don't know where you're getting it from, you're not going to be able to build reports or visuals. You got to know where you're coming from and you got to know where you're headed. And this is a big part in determining where you're coming from, determining the data source, and then cleaning up the data, massaging it a little bit and getting it into a format where you can make some of those reports. All right, so that's all I've got in terms of Power Query. This was just barely the tip of the iceberg in terms of Power Query. If there are specific things that you're looking for, some buttons that you weren't sure, have fun with it, play around with it, or reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to let you know of any other questions that you might have. So looks like Bobby is back on. Bobby, do we have any questions or anything, or?
Let's see. Let me pull up the questions here. Nicholas, definitely appreciate you going through all that, very detailed, very technical, and you broke it down nicely for us. So definitely appreciate that. Let's see. There was a question, but I believe you answered it around refreshing your data. Let me find it. Sorry. When you make changes to tables and merge tables and you'd like to be able to refresh your Power BI, it says, does Power BI then get the updated and the recent data from your ERP system, or is there what has to be done to get that updated?
Yeah, a lot of the times it's just a simple refresh. There's a button where you choose your data source or for pre-existing data sources inside of Power BI, and it's as easy as refreshing your data. And depending on, again, that data source, if you have an Excel file stored out in OneDrive, then it can pull those data sources. Or if you have something like a connection to Dynamics 365 Business Central, which a lot of our clients do, then it will automatically pull new GL entries, new sales orders, new purchase orders, new items, anything that has been created, it will automatically pull that data and update your charts for you.
Perfect. Thank you. And as people are asking questions, please remember, use that Q&A, use the chat box, and we'll definitely be sure to address those. Did want to remind everybody of the future webinars next month, March 25th at 2 p.m., building dashboards, and then April 13th, publishing and sharing reports. And we will be picking up from this point. So definitely, as Nicholas mentioned, a bit of a cliffhanger here, but definitely tune into our future webinars. So a couple other questions here, Nicholas, coming in. Asking about Power BI, if it is on-premise or remote. I believe that can be accessed in both the cloud or on your desktop. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
There's the Power BI desktop. That's for building reports. So when you're doing Power Query, pulling your data, that kind of thing. And then when you're building your report, the next session, Matt will show you using Power BI desktop. But then the third session, which is the publishing and sharing your reports with other people, you can create a web version of your report and allow other people to access it. It's more of a dashboard. You're not going to be doing much powerful editing or very powerful editing or anything like that. But that's the options of on-prem versus hosted, so to speak.
Perfect. Thank you. Appreciate that. And I know that we have several other questions coming in as well, and certainly appreciate everybody's enthusiasm and interest about Power BI. With that, we will probably go ahead and just pause the webinar here. We have definitely noted all of these questions that have come in, and we will certainly reach out to you if we weren't able to answer it directly on this webinar with you. We'll be sure to follow up with you afterwards. Again, please register for our future webinars. If you have questions or you're further interest in Power BI, definitely reach out to us. Here we've listed our website and our phone number. And then here is my direct contact information. So if you have questions or interest in having our TrinSoft team help build some Power BI reports for you, we would definitely be happy to have those conversations with you. With that, we certainly appreciate everybody's interest, and we hope that you can join us on the next couple of webinars to come. Thank you, guys, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thanks, Nicholas, for presenting.
No problem. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.